My next guest is Erik Hooks, FEMA's Deputy Administrator. I sat down with him not too long ago. Have a listen. Erik Hooks, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Bob.
I wanted to ask you first question. The Biden administration recently announced a $3 billion initiative on climate resiliency. Can you tell us a little bit about that effort?
Yes, Bob. As our nation faces more frequent and severe disasters, our agency is acknowledging the impact of climate change. And we're very grateful that under President Biden's leadership, along with great partnerships from the Congress, that FEMA and the entire executive branch is taking a whole of government approach to tackling the issue of climate change head on. Specifically, we just recently announced the additional funding for our annual resilience grants programs that traditionally have been around $700 million to more than $3 billion for fiscal year 2022.
And can you give us an idea of how this will be spread out and how it will affect vulnerable communities as far as the funding is concerned?
Yes. Let me begin by saying that, the impacts of climate change leading to more persistent disasters and stronger impact from disasters don't discriminate, but a number of vulnerable communities recover less well. So we will be targeting opportunities to provide funding to those communities. Specifically, there are two grant programs that I'll discuss with $3 billion. The funding level for BRIC, which we call it, which is Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, is the program which funds projects that protect people and infrastructure from natural hazards and the effects of climate change. And again, that amount of money has doubled. We also have our flood mitigation assistance, which those projects will mitigate against flood risk facing homes and communities, and that money has dramatically increased as well.
We've seen this year, we've seen some massive weather shifts, we've seen fires, record drought. What is your advice to local communities across the country? And so many of them are facing climate change challenges. What's your overall advice to them, both short term and long term?
Sure. I have the experience of coming from a state who has suffered in an inordinate amount of disasters within the last few years prior to coming to FEMA. So my advice to all of those states is that whereas states and the federal government has really done well in response mode, we all really need to pivot toward mitigation. The smart investment of funds in mitigation on the front end can reduce pain and suffering and save lives on the back end. Overall, we talked about the $3 billion that was recently announced, but really the landmark legislation from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which was championed by President Biden and thankfully agreed upon by Congress, will allow FEMA to invest in community-wide mitigation to reduce disaster suffering. So we want to invest in projects that make the infrastructure stronger, that makes the communities more resilient to those storms that will surely come.
With the infrastructure bill, you mentioned it was bipartisan, a big legislative victory for President Biden. As far as, is this one of the biggest investments that you've seen in combating climate change?
Absolutely. And not only is it a victory for President Biden, it's a victory for all involved. It's a victory for the entire country, particularly those communities that have been dramatically impacted by flooding and other such natural hazards over the last few years. And so it's really a game changer in my point of view, that we can invest in communities, we can provide for a more resilient infrastructure so that ultimately we can have a more resilient nation.
What can stakeholders do? I know you're working with a lot of people at the local level, but affiliated groups and stakeholders, what have you seen at the local level when everything, either it's responding to an emergency and the effort goes well? What is going on when there's that success after some type of rough condition or disaster?
Well, I've seen it personally in my own career. I previously served in North Carolina, and I reflect back to Hurricane Florence, how when the community comes together, both government and the private sector and faith-based organizations can all pull together, that you can save and sustain lives and really help your communities get back to a sense of normalcy more quickly. And as we look at the opportunities that smart strategic investments can make in those communities that have suffered from disastrous and repetitive flooding through the years, it's a great opportunity for us to invest in communities, to improve the local economy, and to make those communities more resilient into the long term.
Looking at the long term, where do you want to see policymakers and investments so that in 5 to 10 years things are getting better, or at least we're dealing with a problem that's getting worse, and it's not getting, when can we kind of turn the corner? What do we have to do that?
Well, I think that the jury kind of is still out for that. But what I can say that there has been plenty of research to indicate that, from the government standpoint, that an investment of $1 in mitigation can save us $6 of disaster cost on the back end. And when we factor in strong building codes, that $1 investment can save us $11 on the back end. So it's strategically sound investments that we need to take to combat the threats of the hazards that we face all across the country. We're seeing, as you mentioned early on, increased flooding, wildfires, all types of manners of natural hazards. And so that's why I'm especially pleased to lift up the funding that has been provided under the leadership of the administration and the concurrence of Congress. And also, while we are in National Preparedness Month, lift up the idea that in order to be a prepared nation, we need to be prepared at the local individual level. And that extends all the way up to the federal government. And the federal government, in particular FEMA, is there for those communities as they try to build more resilient.
Erik, can you give us an idea of, when we're writing about legislation and it passes, a lot of people think that's the end of the story, but really that's the beginning of the story as far as implementation. How does it work in the government? On climate change, there's so many different departments that have some type of responsibility on climate change. How does that work? And I would imagine as this massive bill is being implemented more, there's got to be a lot of interagency communication and coordination.
Absolutely. As far as the bill process, oftentimes you may have an authorization, but you may have to come back later to get the actual dollars that are appropriated to fund those programs. And we see that in a number of pieces of legislation that move through the Congress and ultimately signed by the president. This administration has been decisively engaged with having all of the departments come together as we talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law, at this point, so that we can talk about the various things that we're doing as individual agencies so that we can gain synergies into helping build more resilient communities, because it is tremendously helpful for FEMA to know what DOT and EPA and the Interior, what investments they're able to make in communities as we complement those communities with disaster programs into the future.
Well, when you look at the climate change provisions in this new infrastructure law, what amount of time? When do you think we will see? Because as we've talked about, it takes a while to implement some of the more complicated language in it, to dole out the money. When do you think that people will see, okay, we are making progress? Is it a year? Is it 2? Is it a 5-year program?
I think all of the above. I think that there are some immediate wins that you will see as projects from the year previous start coming to fruition. The administrator and I have been across the country and have viewed several projects that have taken form, but recovery never comes quick enough for communities. And sometimes these projects will take a number of years. And so there's the whole process of appropriations that has to take place. And then there's the actual development of the programs within the federal government. And as we work with our state, local, and tribal partners to make sure that there's a great understanding of how these programs would be rolled out. The programs that I've mentioned to you, they're by and large competitive programs. So those state, local, tribal territories would have to apply for those grants. There are some that are set aside for our tribal nation partners, but they have to compete for projects that are viable, projects that fit within the legislative intent of the Congress. And we're trying every day to look for ways to streamline that process, but recovery and the building of a more resilient community does take a while.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but Erik Hooks, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate your knowledge on this very important topic.
Thank you. My pleasure to be with you today.